Well, we're kind of coming to the end of our series called Money's Worth. We'll finish it up next week. But we've been talking about how God sees our money, what's it worth to Him. And we said at the beginning that this is important because the Bible has so much to say about our money. And Jesus had a lot to say about it, more than heaven or hell. And over half of his parables dealt with how we manage our money. So we're going to talk about it a couple more weeks, and then we'll end it up. Now, we're coming up in January on 20 years as a church at Creeks End. We started almost 20 years ago in January. And back when we were first getting started, my three youngest were still in high school, and I drove around a little Ford Ranger. I don't even know if they make them anymore. It's the small truck that Ford makes, you know. And one day, one of my kids was driving it home from school. I won't say which one. But she had an accident, and for some reason, they totaled the truck. And I just didn't think there was that much damage, but evidently it wasn't worth that much anyway. So I was in the market for a new vehicle. Now, I don't buy new vehicles. The last new vehicle I bought was 1986, okay? I buy used, and, it's okay with me if they've got a little bit of mileage on them because I'm going to wear them down all the way. So I'm in the market for a car, and at the time, y'all probably know who Mike and Paulette Cato is. They were driving around a Chrysler Sebring convertible, okay? And they let me take Diana out a couple of times in it and take the kids out in it. And I thought, I'd like to have one of these. So I called up a friend of mine who I'd bought probably 10 used cars from. He had a used car dealership, but he didn't have it anymore. But I called him up and I said, hey, can you help me find a car? I'm looking for about a 2003, 2004 Chrysler Sebring convertible. And I want about 30,000 miles on it, something like that. And here's what I want to pay for it. And so he said, I'll see what I can do. Well, a couple of weeks later, he calls me. He says, I think I found your car. And I said, great. Where is it? And he told me where to go, and so I went to look at it, and it looked exactly like Mike and Paul Cato's Chrysler Sebring convertible, but I didn't care. I said, this is it. It's the money I want to pay. It's great. So I got my convertible, and I'm thinking, here I am in my 40s. I want to let the top down, and I want to let my hair down. And yes, back then I did have hair, okay? So anyway, I had a great time with that car. Took the kids around in it. Took my wife around in it, and we cruised around in style. And then a couple of years later, I had a doctor's appointment, and I pulled into the parking lot, and the only space open I pulled into, and right next to me was a brand new Chrysler Sebring. But it wasn't a convertible like mine. I just looked at it and went, that's really sporty looking. It was cool looking. And, that's about all I could do was admire it because it was new. I mean, brand new. And I went inside and had my appointment. And when I was coming out, the guy who owned it was getting into his car. And so he started it up, and I'm walking toward my car, and all of a sudden, the most wonderful thing happens. His roof began to move. And I'm like, what? I'd never seen a hard-top convertible before. And so he's putting this thing down, and so I start walking around looking at him and smile at him and said, wow, this is a great-looking car. I mean, as soon as he put the top down, I could smell the leather, smell the new car, that new car smell. I said, wow. And he said, yeah, it's got all the latest gadgets. Just check this navigation system out. And I got a place to put my iPod. That was back before I guess you could do smartphone stuff. But anyway, I went, man. Well, he left, and I got into my car, and suddenly, I didn't like my car anymore. My car smelled like family. Sweaty teenagers and daughter's perfumes, and my wife had taken it to the dental office a few times, so it smelled a little dental in it. And so I started thinking to myself, I wonder if I should just upgrade. Man, that is a cool-looking car. It's got all the latest things. How can I? And then I just said to myself, stop. There's that thing again. You know that thing that when you walk into someone's house and it's prettier than your house and it's bigger than your house, and ladies, that kitchen is your dream kitchen and you hate your kitchen? You know that thing when you walk in and you see a 90-inch 4K smart TV which dwarfs your 70-inch, and you think, oh my gosh. Or they have a pool and you don't. It's that thing inside of us, and you felt it, and you go, why do I have 2 gigs when they have 10? Why do I have this when they have that? And it's just that thing. And it's an ugly little thing. It's an ugly little word called discontentment. Say that with me. Discontentment. Yeah, it's an ugly little word. It's that thing inside of us that makes it so amazing what we talk ourselves into when it comes to our money. And we see things, and we can talk ourselves into it, we can talk to our spouse and talk them into it, that we have to have that. And we didn't know we had to have that until we saw somebody else have that. And now we have to have it. It's kind of, you didn't know you needed it till you saw somebody else had one, and that's that thing, discontentment, that can ruin so many people financially. And it's primarily a Western thing. It gets worse as our culture becomes more materialistic. And we live in this world where we're constantly reminded of what we don't have. We didn't know we need those things until we saw they existed. It's like those times, and we've both been there, where we go into Costco, or we go into Lowe's, or we go into Walmart, and we're going to get one thing. And that doesn't happen, does it? You come out with at least 10 things or 20 things, and as one guy told me earlier, you don't even come out with what you went in there for because you got all this other stuff. So this kind of brings us to what we're going to talk about today. Discontentment is like an appetite. It's never fully satisfied, and we live in a culture which is a blessing and a curse, where every single day of our lives we see stuff that we don't have. And we're constantly bombarded with how far behind we are. We're constantly bombarded with how out of style that we are. We're constantly bombarded with, well, you only have 2 gigs and somebody else has 10 gigs and now they have 20. And it's just, do you remember thinking this is the last car I'll ever buy? You remember thinking this is the house that we'll probably have forever? You remember thinking, I'll wear this forever. But what you do with that, what do you do with it? Because it's an appetite, discontentment. How do you shelter yourself from this appetite? Well, last week I gave you a question and we answered it instead of a main truth. So I want to do that again today. I want to start with a question, and then later on we'll answer it. And here's the question. How do I survive financially in a culture that fuels my appetite of discontent? How do I hold that appetite in check? How do I shelter myself? Because it's an appetite, and appetites don't go away. What do I do? Because it has the potential to drive us into financial ruin. So if you have a Bible, we're going to be in 1 Timothy chapter 6. And this is a passage of Scripture that is addressed to rich people. Now, before you tune me out and say, well, that counts me out, by New Testament terms, 90% of us fall into the category of rich people. Because in the New Testament, a rich person was someone who had more than they needed. So when you look at it that way, we are all considered wealthy, aren't we? Because we have more than we need. We just want more. So these verses are for all of us. And I want to begin reading in verse 6. But godliness with contentment is great gain. For we brought nothing into the world, and we can take nothing out of it. But if we have food and clothing, we will be content with that. Those who want to get rich fall into temptation and a trap and into many foolish and harmful desires that plunge people into ruin and destruction. For the love of money is a root of all kinds of evil. Some people eager for money have wandered from the faith and pierced themselves with many griefs. But you, man of God, flee from all this and pursue righteousness, godliness, faith, love, endurance, and gentleness. And then skipping down to verse 17, he says, command those who are rich in this present world not to be arrogant, nor to put their hope in wealth, which is so uncertain, but to put their hope in God, who richly provides us with everything for our enjoyment. Command them to do good, to be rich in good deeds, and to be generous and willing to share. In this way, they will lay up treasure for themselves as a firm foundation for the coming age, so that they may take hold of the life that is truly life. Let's just stop and ask God to open our hearts to this today. Father, would you show us today what we need to do to change and shelter ourselves from this appetite of discontent? What do we need to start doing? What do we need to stop doing? Just show us today how we can shelter ourselves from discontentment. And we ask this in your name. Amen. Now, the opposite of discontentment is what? Contentment. Contentment. Now, I am not naturally content. In my fallen nature, I am naturally discontent, and so are you. And I'm not content because I'm always playing out in my mind the if-onlys. If only I made more money. If only I had a better job that paid more money. If only I won the lottery. If only, if only, if only. And we live in that kind of world, and for all of us, the if-onlys are endless. And in our self-idolatry, we tend to think that some change in the environment is going to bring us joy and contentment. And for us, the grass is always greener until we learn to find contentment in something that is transcendent and eternal. So let's see if Paul has an answer to this question. How do I survive financially in a culture that's constantly fueling my appetite of discontent? Go back to verse 6, and we're going to start piecing some things out here. He says, but godliness with contentment is great gain. In other words, if you can find contentment and you can follow God, then you're set. That's a good thing. He says, for we brought nothing into the world, and we can take nothing out of it. Now, there's something we all know, and something that no one can argue with. Yet we have the tendency in our lives to live our lives as if it depends on what we own. You remember last week we talked about this. Our lives don't equal what we own. We can't be measured by what we own. Paul says, let's go back to the basics. You didn't bring anything with you. You're not going to take anything with you. Remember last week we talked about those billionaires that lost their lives in that sub. How much money did they leave? All of it. All of it. See, it ought to be easy to be content, Paul says, if you started with nothing. I mean, if you have anything, you have more than you started with. And after you leave, you're going to leave it behind anyway. So contentment should be pretty easy to find. So in verse 8, he says, but if we have food and clothing, we will be content with that. To which I'm tempted to say, but I'm not. I don't want just food, and I don't just want the shirt on my back. I want more. But when you read that, you know intuitively that there's some truth there. That if I and my family, if you and your family, if they just have enough to eat, clothes to wear, a roof over their head, that should be content. That should be enough. And anything beyond that is extra. But there's something in me and something in you that is not satisfied with just that. So these next few verses are important. In verse 9, he says, those who want to get rich fall into temptation and a trap and into many foolish and harmful desires that plunge people into ruin and destruction. Now, let me just stop here, and I want you to write this truth down. People who are discontent are easily trapped. They're easily trapped. He says, those of you who are not content with just food and clothing, you need to know that you're set up for some very specialized temptations. You're set up for some very specific temptations that people in third world countries, they can't even imagine and can't even fall into it. And I don't even need to illustrate this for you because you know people or you're related to people whose money ruined them. The more they got, the more they spent, and they got themselves in incredible trouble because they had more than they needed and they spent it on themselves. And they just couldn't stop that appetite. If you have more than you need, there are temptations and sins that you can fall into, Paul says. Now in verse 10, he says, for the love of money, that is, prioritizing the pursuit of money above other things, like ethics, morality, your family, the love of money is a root of all kinds of evil. You know what? Some of you could say that the love of money is what tore my home apart. The love of money is what tore my marriage apart. My wife or husband got on their career track and they fell in love with what they were doing and the money they were making from it, and it totally disintegrated our marriage or our family. You probably know people like that. You may know people in prison because of their love of money. And Paul says, some people eager for money have wandered from the faith and pierced themselves with many griefs. Now let's make sure you get that. Write it down. People who are discontent can easily walk away from their faith. If you have more than you need, you can be tempted to walk away from God because of your pursuit of wealth. Now, I know people who have done that. Maybe you do too. In fact, two people come to my mind who used to be here at Creek's Inn years ago, and they went off and suddenly they made a lot of money. They were very successful, and they just disappeared. And you check up on them, and they're not going to church anywhere, and they are just having a great time with their money. You probably know people who've done that too. In fact, some of you may be back after wandering from the faith because of money. And maybe God took it away to show you, you need me, not that. So verse 11 says this, but you, man of God, woman of God, flee from all this and pursue righteousness, godliness, faith, love, endurance, and gentleness. Now this is huge. What he does for us is he gives us the framework of how to deal with our discontentment. If you have more than you need, and that's most of us, you have to make a conscious decision to stop pursuing money and start pursuing something else. Let me put it this way. People who are content pursue something other than money. People who are content pursue something other than money. The temptation will be to pursue the extra and to spend it on us. But people who are content make the grown-up decision, he says, to flee from all this and pursue something entirely different. Stop pursuing money and start pursuing righteousness. Stop pursuing money and start pursuing godliness, faith, love, endurance, gentleness. See, that's the only way that you're going to escape falling into the trap in this endless cycle of discontentment. And in the next few verses, Paul defines for us what it means to pursue righteousness and godliness and love and all those things, but I don't have time to go into it. So I want to skip down to verse 17 and see what he says about pursuing something entirely different. Here's what he says. Command those who are rich in this present world. That means you have more than you need. Command them not to be arrogant, nor to put their hope in wealth, which is so uncertain, but to have and put their hope in God, who richly provides us with everything for our, what's that next word? Enjoyment. Enjoyment. He says, look, this isn't a guilt trip message. This isn't you shouldn't have so much that you ought to feel guilty for what you have. No, if you're rich in this present world, you should enjoy your wealth. The Bible is full of people who were wealthy. Did you know that? Job was very wealthy. Abraham was very wealthy. David was very, very wealthy. And his son Solomon was triple wealthy. In fact, his son Solomon in today's dollars was worth $2.2 trillion. That's pretty wealthy, huh? He's saying, look, you should enjoy your wealth. Just don't put your hope in it. So he says, verse 18, command them, those who are rich, to do good, to be rich in good deeds, and to be generous and willing to share. That's why God has allowed you to be rich in good deeds. Now listen, I'm talking about being known in your life, not for what you have, but for what you do with what you have. Does that make sense? Not that people are amazed at where you live or what you drive, but people are amazed at what you've done with where you live and what you drive. See, this is so important. People who are content are willing to share, he says. People who are content are willing to share. They're willing to take their extra that they don't really need and be generous with it. They're willing to leverage having more than they need and invest it in eternal purposes. And in verse 19, he says this, in this way, by pursuing something other than money, being willing to share, in this way, they will lay up treasure for themselves as a firm foundation for the coming age, and I love this phrase, so that they may take hold of the life that is truly life. This is such a great word picture for the culture and society that we live in today, because the temptation is to take hold of a life that isn't really a life. A life that isn't really fulfilling, and it's caught up in the pursuit of trying to feed an appetite of discontent that never, ever ends. But there is real life, Paul says, out there for people who will leverage their extra and put it into good deeds and in generosity and being willing to share. Paul says it doesn't even compare. You can avoid all those traps and temptations that come from being wealthy. Prosperity is a very difficult test to pass. You know that, right? Wealth is a very difficult test to pass. And I know most of you would say, well, I sure would like to take the test. But anyway, it's hard. It's hard. See, there are extra temptations that go along with that. And you and I both have watched people who've had a lot of money, suddenly their lives get so messed up because they weren't willing to take their extra and invest it in eternal things. See, that wealth has brought many a man down, brought many a marriage down, brought many a family down. So do you remember the question that we asked at the beginning? How do I survive financially in a culture that's constantly fueling my appetite of discontent? And Paul has given us the answer. It's simple, but it's not easy. You know how you do it? By being generous. By being generous. Generosity is what shelters us from discontentment. Now, I'm not talking about being generous just by giving to the church. That's just one way. I'm talking about something that this is for you. Your generosity is what will bridle discontent. You can't make your discontentment go away. You can't pretend that you don't want things. You can't stay out of the mall forever. We're talking about managing an appetite. And here's what the Bible teaches here and all through the New Testament. Generosity, intentional, and I would add strategic. Generosity is what shelters us from our discontentment and keeps us from diving into unhealthy financial decisions when it comes to our money. And see, here's the problem. We are constantly made aware every day of what we don't have. So we have to go out of our way to become aware of what other people don't have. See, if you live in Spring and the Woodlands and Tomball and Magnolia in this area here, you know, you could spend your whole life not being aware of someone else's needs because we don't see homeless on the street everywhere that we go. And I would probably say that most of you don't have a relationship with a truly, genuinely poor person. That's just the reality of the world we live in. So the only way that we can become aware of needs is to intentionally bring ourselves to an awareness that there are people in need. Now, those of you who have traveled with us to some third world countries like Haiti, and soon to come Honduras, and in living water, other places all over the world. Those of you who've been on those trips, you've experienced that, and you've seen it firsthand. And when you saw it, you were ready to give the shirt off of your back because you saw someone that didn't have a shirt. But it's an intentional pursuit of something other than money. And most of us, we have to do that artificially. But you have to go out of your way to find the needs, find the ministries, and be generous. It's the only way that you're going to bridle that discontent that's so prevalent in our culture. And some of you have done that. You know, we bring needs to mind all the time here at Creeks Inn, especially around the holidays and things. But, you know, we baptized some kids in the last service. 2 of them were my granddaughters, by the way. And I got the privilege of doing that. We'll baptize more because some of those kids couldn't go to camp, couldn't afford to go to camp. But some of you said, I'll pay their way to camp. You saw a need. You invested in it. And today you get to see some of the fruit of that through baptism. I enjoy being generous. I enjoy taking the extra God's given me and putting it back into circulation. So I'm not asking you to do anything that I'm not willing to do, but you have to make an effort. You have to find the needs. I read this little saying the other day. It says, when you're in the Starbucks line and you have that urge to pay for coffee the person behind you, you ever done that? Or someone's done that for you? Here's what they said. That person behind you can afford the coffee. Why don't you call a school up and pay for some kid's overdue lunch bill? But see, that's looking for the need. You have to go out and intentionally look for it. And we have plenty of needs that we'll give you here at Creeks Inn, and we'll direct you to some of that. But some of this you need to do on your own. Find those needs and be generous. And as your awareness grows, your generosity will grow. What if we all did this? What if we all did this? What a wonderful world it would be. Because we all have more than we need. Come on, admit it. And if you just jacked your lifestyle down a little bit, you'd have even more. Come on. Be generous. Hold that discontent in check by writing a check to someone in need. Would you pray with me? Every head bowed, every eye closed. And as I said and prayed earlier, the question to ask is, God, what do you need me to do? What can I stop doing? What can I start doing? What can I change so that I can be generous? For some of you, that may be a journey that you need to take to start getting to the place where you're generous and getting out of debt and beginning to give in the first place. But if you're sincere about it and you're seeking God about it, He will show you how to do just that, because that's what He's about, giving. So, Father, I lift up every single person in this room today. We are all, in your terms, rich. We all have more than we need. So, Father, would you show us where we can take what we don't need and give it to those who are in need. Show us how to bridle, how to be sheltered from that appetite of discontent. And as we do that, Father, as our awareness of the needs grow, our generosity will grow as well. So use us, Father, as you would, to invest in eternal purposes. And we ask this in your name.